Gold? That was some of my best stuff. All right, here we go. So tactic 10, expand the options, creative financing. Expand the options, creative financing. Money talks and often says goodbye. I love that quote. Money talks and often says goodbye. So here's the thing that can be a large mental shift for us as we look at tactic 10 and as we get into this market and all of its new excitements. There's a lot of things that you've been doing that you didn't realize were negotiable. They've become so habitual that that's just how we do business, right? And I will tell you, one of the gifts that I've experienced running offices for Keller Williams in 3 different states of New England is I'm always coming into it with this fresh set of eyes going, like, I get it, but you don't have to. Right? There are things that we do in our local colloquial brokerage community that probably will need to be shaken up. And financing and creative financing on deals is one of those things that can often show up early in a shift. So one of the things, if you were on with the Keller Williams Young Professionals, we talked, I don't even know what day anymore. Maybe it was Tuesday. But one of the things we talked about there is in the state of Massachusetts, your typical contract is about 15 pages long. Now, Jen, how long is the typical purchase and sale agreement in Rhode Island?
4 pages.
4 pages. Rick Dow, how many pages are we up to in the state of Maine for our typical contract?
I believe it's 5.
About 5 pages. So, and I don't think Connecticut's much longer, and I don't think Vermont's much longer. So somewhere between 5 pages and 15 pages. Now, in each and every one of those contracts, I can almost guarantee you that the price takes up how much space?
1 line. Maybe
1
2.
line. 1 frickin' line of 15 pages. So what the hell's the rest of it? Terms. It is always a conversation of a balancing act between price and terms. And so much of the environment we have been in has been a limiting terms and increasing price conversation. Does that make sense, bobblehead? That makes sense, right? We got to get my people to offer more and get rid of conditions, get rid of terms, make it as clean and as simple as possible. I get it. And the world's going to be shifting, okay? So just think about every line of the contract as a potential negotiating point. I'll give you an example that's come up a lot in the last few days. We have in multiple areas here, we've got COVID-19 language that's getting added to people's contracts, right? Well, if this with COVID and that and da-da-da, and you know, some boards of realtors are coming out with it, some brokerages are coming out with it, and a lot of agents are attaching it kind of blindly to contracts going like, well, I guess this is what we need to do. That whole addendum, all of that language is just as negotiable as any other piece of language in the freaking contract. You know, the first one that came across my desk, somebody was like, well, hey, man, this really sounds like it's benefiting the buyer. I'm like, yeah, because the buyer's agent wrote it. It better freaking benefit the buyer. Now you're the agent who represents the seller. Take a pen to it, cross some shit out, right? Modify it, right? It's a negotiation. It's a negotiation, right? Just because it was printed in black and white ink, don't make it so. Every darn thing about a real estate contract is basically negotiable. And we've got to get working those muscles again. And I want to talk about that through the filter of financing, okay? But I wanted to start more broadly and just say, hey, this is the entire contract, right? Rent backs, those are going to become more prevalent, I'd be willing to bet, right? different condition things about the home, right? My mother-in-law is living in a property right now. She beat out 10 other offers the day she bought that property. And the reason she beat them out was not because she offered more, because I know for a fact she didn't. She beat them out because she offered the owners to have occupancy in the property for 30 days after closing, and they could leave anything they wanted to in the home at the day the property actually transferred hands. The property had been in the family for 140 years. The seller was 102 years old. Their kids were selling it and they were in their 70s. Do you think it was a big benefit to them to A, get the cash up front before they had to move, and B, be able to leave whatever they wanted to in the old barn? You're darn right. In fact, it meant so much to them that they took thousands of dollars less. Everything is freaking negotiable, right? So we got to start thinking creatively. One of the ways we do that is we got to start asking a lot more questions of our co-broke. Now, are we allowed to ask questions of our co-broke? Can we ask the question, hey, why are they selling? We allowed to ask that question?
Yes.
Yes. Now, should the co-broke answer?
No.
Yeah, probably not. But that's not on you. That's on them. You can ask the darn question. Hey, just curious, why they selling? Oh God, they've been living in, together for like 2 months straight, and under this COVID, they're getting divorced. They just don't tell me that, but you did. So now I get to use it. Okay. So just dust off your ability to ask questions. You would be surprised what you can learn by being nice, by being cooperative and helpful, and by asking a bunch of questions. Those questions are to the benefit of whose client?
Ours.
Yours, yes. Your client is the one who's going to benefit. And I'm pretty sure that's who we owe a fiduciary duty to. I have to double check my real estate license law, but I'm pretty sure that's who we're working for, right? So let's talk about some creative financing options here. Wahoo, here we go. So we're going to put these in a couple of different buckets, and I'll be honest and transparent with you. There's a couple of these that I don't really have experience with. So if you do have experience with them and we get to them, please hop off and pitch in. And if you have questions, if I go too fast through some of these and you're like, what the hell is that? Ask, throw it in the comments, unmute, ask, here we go. So first off, seller contributions, right? We're going to talk about things that the seller can do to help stick deals together creatively. Seller contributions. Well, with a lot of these deals over the last few years going over asking price, seller contributions were not a common thing for a while, right? We weren't having a lot of seller contributions towards the buyer's closing costs. So that's something we want to get back into. Here's where you might find it. One of our great lenders up in Maine here, is just letting us know, like, what somebody could get for no points with a 640 credit score a month ago, they're now going to have to pay some points, or they have to be more like a 680 credit score. So that new cost for them at the time of closing to get that better rate and to be able to qualify, now we may have to go to the seller and say, hey, we're still interested in buying, but I need you to kick in these $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 towards the buyer's prepaid and closing costs so that we can keep this sucker going, okay? Number two, and I'm playing on page 202 for all of you who've got your shift book out. Seller-funded permanent buy down, a seller-funded permanent buy down. So let's say because of the shifting market, the buyer's ability to pay with that loan is now being compromised, and we have to buy down the rate because of rate volatility, right? They were willing to buy up to 4%, and because of volatility in the market, now they can only qualify for 4.5%. The seller could buy down the rate so that the buyer still qualifies at under 4%. Okay, so sellers buying down that rate is a creative financing tool we can use. Seller-funded temporary buy down. Now, a temporary buy down is that I've seen in action is things like a homeowner association fee, right? When people's money gets tight, when they're worried about, hey, maybe they haven't lost their job, but they're worried about like that overtime pay. And now that $200 or $300 a month condominium association fee is becoming a real sticking point in whether they're going to buy this property or not. The seller could prepay a couple of years of the homeowner association fee or the condo fee or flood insurance. Following? Bobblehead? So those are tools that the seller could use to make it temporarily more affordable for the buyer, help ease some pressure on them, keep them confident, keep them at the table. Owner financing. Owner financing as a whole is a whole technique we can be using. Owner financing basically says that the seller is also going to be the lender, right? Pretty simple concept. The seller will also be the lender. Now, this is real easy to structure if the seller does not have a note on the property, right? If they own it outright and the buyer needs to borrow money against the property to afford it, the seller could play the role of the bank. Now, think about this. Let's say going rate right now is 3.5% to 4%. Do you think for seller financing, we could charge a slight premium? Nod and agree. Yes? Probably a slight premium we could charge. So let's say I could charge 5% on the owner finance. So I'm selling a $300,000 house. The buyer has $100,000 to put down, and I'm going to owner finance $200,000 at a 5% interest rate. Well, think where else could I put that money right now? If I've got $200,000 as a seller, am I putting that in the stock market today? Maybe not, right? With the volatility that I'm seeing there, you know, yeah, maybe in the past I was able to get a double-digit return in the stock market, but I don't know if I'm going to get that over the next couple of years. So it might be a more secure bet for me to loan $200,000 to a buyer that's got a great equity position, to an asset that is insurable, and then have a balloon payment structure 3 years out, 5 years out, 7 years out, something like that. So ultimately this comes, you know, there's a little end to this rainbow, and I get my money back plus the interest I've made along the way. How does collection work with seller financing? A gun. This is my test to see if people are paying attention. Yeah, no, they're making a payment the same way that they would be paying a bank, only they're paying it directly to the seller. I'm a big fan of it when we've got a large equity position that the buyer has, because if they don't pay, I'm now coming back after them and I can foreclose on them just like a bank can. But that's going to cost me money as a seller, right? So I want enough room in there that if I've got to pay an attorney $10,000 or $20,000 to go through the foreclosure process, that there's a benefit to me still at the end of that rainbow. So I sell a house for $300, buyer puts down $100. They're supposed to pay me my $200. They don't pay. I foreclose. I still got effectively, after the expense of the foreclosure, $300,000 property back, and it cost me 20 grand. So I also got their original 100. I'm still way up on this deal. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, I did structure in the past shift. I structured a deal that was 100% owner financed. You know, is it pretty rare air where that makes sense? Yep, that's pretty rare air. But you know what? All things being equal, it kind of was the best option for the seller at the time. And it was a good option for the buyer. So we did owner finance 100%. And guess what? They paid, and it worked out good. And the buyer moves in and feels like they own the place in the same way as if they just bought it. So they're going to treat the property different than if they were a renter, if that makes sense. Contract for a deed. Contract for a deed. This one I have not used. I have not used contract for a deed. Where my head goes with this kind of stuff is transferable contracts, right? You may be representing somebody right now. and we get something under contract, and instead of like re-going through the process, we transfer the contract from the current buyer to a new buyer. That often happens in flips and wholesaling and that kind of a thing. I have not come across much more experience in that on that particular one. A seller second is another creative financing tool. And a seller second is basically still owner financing, only now instead of being in first position, the buyer put down money, they got a loan from a regular bank, but there's still a gap, and the seller provided a secondary loan, right? But that secondary loan is inferior to the first position. So if they want to foreclose, they actually have to pay off the first loan to get theirs. So they're going to want smaller amount of exposure there typically. And, you know, again, I haven't used that one as much. We see it, where I see that happen is more in like hard money lending, stuff like that, where I've got a loan to purchase the property, but then my hard money lender's given me the fix up. And the fix-up loan is a second to my primary loan for the purchase of the property. So we do see secondary mortgages on houses. It's rare that I think that we see it with a seller. I want to keep my seller's exposure to be small in terms of dollar amount, small in terms of equity position, and small in terms of time. I want that exposure to be limited in terms of time. On we blindly stumble. Lease options, lease to purchase options. This is effectively a rent to own type option, if you've heard of that before. It just usually means that we actually have a structured lease. It isn't month to month. And oftentimes a portion of the lease payment will be credited to their down payment when it comes time to buy. So let's say I've got somebody paying $2,200 a month. 200 of that could be squirreled away towards a down payment. Fast forward 3 years, I've got whatever that works out to, you know, $7,200 that effectively has been a forced savings through this lease option towards the down payment purchase of the property. And again, basically the seller still owns the house, but it gets the buyer in there now. The buyer's treating it like they own it. And usually I see the structure where if the buyer decides not to take the option, that they sacrifice that money that was assigned to the purchase. In other words, the seller gets to keep it. Your commission structure in that model is often a little bit loosey-goosey. It's a negotiable, right? You might get paid on the lease, and then you might also get some additional commission amount when they execute the lease into a purchase. Oftentimes I see it where whatever the lease amount of commission is discounted out of the end game purchase contract. So if I was going to get 3%, maybe it's 3% less whatever I collected in that initial rental lease commission, if that's making sense. A couple more and then we're going to move on. Hi.
Do you see some of the questions on the side of the bar here?
I do, but I'm ignoring all of them.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, what do we got?
Sure you saw. Okay.
So if a buyer has $100,000 or enough equity to protect me, then it's likely they will be able to qualify for financing. I get it. So the point is, well, hey, if they got 100 grand, why can't they qualify for financing? I get it. When the lending market tightens up, it doesn't take much of a hiccup in somebody's life for them to no longer qualify to work with a bank, but you may be willing to take on that risk as a seller. Okay. So the banks may go, hey, you know, you haven't had 2 years history working in that job. No, we're not lending to you. Right. Because we've gotten a little bit more restrictive, but you look at it and go, dude, they're working at a great local employer that we know has a great track record of keeping people. The person's experience is very translatable, even though it's not the same industry. I'm willing to take that risk and play the role of the bank. Another example, we had one where it actually helped made the deal. See, here's the other, ooh, yeah. See, good question. We're getting juicy. So I structured a deal. I represented the seller. I ended up also representing the buyer. The buyer had huge cash position, almost had enough money to buy the place outright, almost. but that would have also exhausted all their cash, and now they would have been house rich, cash poor. So they really didn't want to do that. They also wanted the house for a little bit less money. What a shock. What buyer wants a house for less money, right? So, so we structured the offer where it would be owner financed. Here's the thing. The buyer was going to borrow money no matter what. Why not pay the interest to the seller instead of a bank? The seller's now willing to take less on the property because they know over the 5 years of loaning them the money, they're actually going to get more than they were hoping to net out of that house because of the money they were making on the lending, right? So this can help close that delta between what somebody thinks their home is worth and what the market currently says, right? Helps fill that gap, that owner finance lending. And I'm looking at Charlotte Lou here, who I know you work with a lot of cash buyers and a lot of cash sellers, right? So they've got the kind of equity position where that kind of thing can make sense. They could take a haircut on the price, but if they play the role of the bank, they end up getting all that money anyway. Make sense? They just got to be a little more patient, and they're taking on a little bit of risk. Assumable mortgage, be the last one we talk about. Seller assisted down payment, actually an assumable mortgage. Seller assisted, I often see this, some programs allow for that, but where I've actually seen it more is people's work. Sometimes if somebody's got a relationship with the company that they work for, and the company wants them to be more stable, and they want to find a way to create a stickiness between this great employee and the business. They'll oftentimes loan them the down payment money with some sort of payback structure, which may or may not be attached to the actual property itself. So that could be an option that people could look for as well. Let's move on to some of our buyer options here as well. Hopefully that helped answer that question there. I don't see any others. And now you have a property whose value has been compromised. Does that help the buyer's credit score? I don't understand that. Michael Holland, you want to come off mute and clarify what your question was? Then we'll dive onto the buy side.
It's Michelle, Brad.
Thanks. Look at the big brain on Brad.
No, I meant if the property comes back after financing and it's foreclosed on, that second comment was not mine.
Okay. Yeah, if you have to foreclose on the property, the foreclosure on the property in and of itself does not necessarily lower the value of the property. Okay. What we often see is a combination of the foreclosure and degradation of the property. People have stopped taking care of the property and they've also stopped paying. And now you've got a bank coming on going, I'm not going to frickin' deal with this. Let's slash the price and dump it. But as a local owner who's owner financing, right, I can be more on top of it. I might be willing to do some of the work to get the property back into a pristine condition if need be. Or I'm more likely to go and show up at my lender's door and go, hey, not for nothing. I noticed the last couple of months you haven't paid, and you haven't been answering my emails, you haven't been answering my letters or my calls or my texts. What's going on? What can we do to make this work? How about I give you a couple $1,000 for you guys to move out in the next 30 days? We'll do keys in lieu of foreclosure type of deal. So we can avoid some of this stuff. It's very challenging for a large national bank whose asset management is 6 states away to be able to do those kinds of things. And so oftentimes, Michelle, we see that a foreclosed property is also a distressed property in terms of physical. It doesn't have to be on the owner finance side of it. All right, we got to cook with gas here quick. Gift funds, we kind of already touched on that. The buyer could be getting some gift funds. Again, think not just family, think potential employers as well. Those are some real options. Selling or refinancing existing assets. Right now we're going to see some people who are going to get a cash out refi, on their existing property. And they'll use that money as down payment money on their other home. Or they could, You know, they could take notes out against, again, here's a funky example. My mother sold a house in Pennsylvania, and the funds for the purchase came from a guy selling his antique collection. Now, how this became a creative thing was my mom was dealing with a relocation company. And when the offer came in, contingent on the ability to sell these antiques to get the funds to be able to buy, the relo company was like, are you kidding me? No, we're not touching this thing with a 10-foot pole. And I reviewed it with my mom and I said, hey, you know what? Buyers for your house right now are super rare. If you walk away from this guy, it could be another 6 months. I say you kick the relo company to the curb and dance with the buyer. That's exactly what she did. They had the antique auction. The auction went great. And the guy had hundreds of thousands of dollars out of that sale to execute the purchase of the home. So, you know, just thinking creatively is really what we want to be doing here. Non-occupant co-borrower, non-occupant co-borrower. So that's mom and dad co-signing, even though they're not going to live there. Again, depending on where our pendulum is in terms of the restrictions on financing, may or may not be an option. Local banks are going to be way more open to that with like a portfolio loan than your national, especially like the online versions of stuff. Using 401k funds, I'd seen a little bit of something saying that people might be able to waive some of those fees in terms of withdrawing money from CDs, IRAs, 401ks. Those are some options that I'm seeing some chatter about right now. My local bank sent us an announcement that said, hey, we get it. If you need to pull money out of CDs that you're holding with us currently, all of the penalty fees are being waived for X number of months. So what normally would have been like the major reason not to do it, they've just removed that. They want people to have liquidity right now. You can withdraw 401k without penalty for first-time home purchase. Ding, ding, ding. Thank you, Joey. Temporary IRA transfer, similar thing. Pledged asset mortgage. This is the one that where I'm not 100% sure on what that really means. A pledged asset mortgage. So that homework goes on you. Go figure it out. Equity transfers, bridge loans, we're starting to see some of that back on. I will say you've got to be watching kind of the volatility in not just the interest rate, but also what products are available and who qualifies, right? So we've got these multiple moving sectors right now, all within the lending world. So just because the interest rate is still low doesn't mean your buyer who maybe has credit can still qualify. Or maybe instead of a 10% down, they now have to have 20% down. Well, where the hell's the extra 10% coming from? Well, maybe it could be mom and dad, or maybe it could be a non-occupant co-borrower, that kind of thing, okay? And then lastly, an employer-assisted mortgage. Again, we touched on that already, where employers could be throwing some money at it. VA loans are transferable. Excuse me, they're assumable. A VA loan is an assumable loan, which means I can be a non-veteran, and Jen Bovey is a veteran who owns the house currently. I can assume her VA loan that she has on the house and then just show up with the difference. And the difference might be her holding a second, right? Me having cash, could be any number of things. Know this, that if a veteran has their loan assumed, they cannot immediately go out and use that loan again. They can only have their loan in place that they've earned by being a veteran once at a time. So I can't have the new buyer assume it and then me immediately go out and buy with a VA. Does that make sense? I actually have to wait for that original one to get paid off, refinance, something, before I can use my VA credit again. Also know this, the VA credit is way more expensive the second time you use it. The first time you use it's a very affordable, very attractive thing to help veterans get into home ownership. The second time they're like, we'll give you a little bit, but we're not giving you the farm again, okay? Jen, minute or two for just a couple quick questions and we'll get them out of here.
All right.
Pop off, you got a question, do it. I'll start singing my love songs again.
You were just talking about the VA loan being
Yep.
assumable. Could you work that into, if you had someone who wanted to do that, could you work something into the purchase where the buyer had to refinance, or the assumable person had to refinance
Yes.
within a certain time period?
Yeah, I think that is possible. That could be structured. Say, hey, we'll let you assume this, but effectively some sort of balloon time frame.
Right.
I'm not an attorney. I'm not sure how you would structure that and have it attached to the property. But yeah, I got to figure there's some vehicles we could use to force their hand on that down the road. One more. Yes, double check your VA assumable with the lender. What happens, VA is incredibly lenient. Many times what we do is we come across lenders who have their own overlays on top of what the VA says. And now all of a sudden it feels like a very restrictive package. The VA package itself is very liberal. It has lots of flexibility. I'm pretty sure I closed one years ago where the guy had no credit score because VA had no credit score demand, right? But you had to work with the right lender who was willing to remove the overlays. And they should be willing to do it because who's backing this thing? If there's a default, who's paying the tab?
So Brad, one thing I want to
The
mention about
feds. Go ahead, Amanda.
the VA loan, we do like 70+% of our business is VA loan.
Yep.
Depending on who the lender is, they charge an origination fee that is
Yep.
1%. And in
Mhm.
our area, this can be $4,000, $5,000, $6,000.
Yep.
And some lenders don't offer that they can waive that. So
Right.
if you have a VA buyer, ask them who their lender is. Like, ask more questions, because I guarantee you these people that are putting veterans this and veterans this in front of their
Yeah.
mortgage name do not have the best interest of the client.
Many times they don't. Many times they're using it just as a marketing tactic. Working with local professionals, I think, especially when it comes to a VA product, that has been my best scenario. I find that VA, RD, state specific, like state backed stuff, and I was thinking about one other category. But anyway, that those things, like, you want to find somebody who really knows what they're talking about with those specific products. Oh yeah, the home plus improvement loan. That was the other one I was thinking. If somebody's never done a home plus improvement loan, you probably don't want to be their guinea pig. Okay, I'd rather be working with that local professional who, that's a big part of what they do all the time. Find them, work with them. And I find that's the same with some of these other different vehicles. Buy down rate points language. Is it something that comes at closing? Does that delay mortgage? No, the buying down the rate, I mean, that's going to be a negotiable thing almost out of the gate. I want to know that my buyers need that rate bought down, and I want to be asking for that rate up front and as we're negotiating that contract. Or if the financing's about to fall apart, that's when I would open it up and say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, here's the option. Like, either we let these people go and they can get out under their financing contingency, or we offer to buy down the rate for them. We keep the buyer, we take a little bit of a haircut, but we get to move on. Okay. We've gone way over. Love you guys. Be well, be safe. We're back at it on Monday. We've got a couple of more days of shift, and then we're shifting topics after that, but we're going to keep it going. Right, Jen?
That's right. We're going to get another series out there talking about fierce conversations. So,
Love
excited about
it.
that.
See y'all
Meet
later.
you guys Monday.
Bye.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellent.
Thanks.